Hey, so Casey, let me start with you. I thought it was very interesting. Watched you last night with Avenatti. I'm just wondering, well, were you able to get more than one question in with him?
It was unclear, Joe. Yeah.
It was, wow. And every time you tried to ask a question, you go, don't interrupt me. Let me finish. And it was like 30-minute answers. It's unbelievable. Tell me, first of all, do you think Avenatti's running for president?
It seems entirely obvious to me that, yes, he is running for president. I mean, I've heard he's been having off-the-record dinners with reporters, and, I mean, he was just in New Hampshire yesterday. He's actually, more than anyone else, doing all the things that you normally do in the invisible primary phase.
Yeah, but last night he was spitting out all of his, if you or your family members have been arrested, I brought in $4.5 billion in verdicts, so-and-so named me the law. He sounded like Lionel Hutz on The Simpsons last night. He was advertising his law firm more than, on your show, more than it seemed he was running for president. But we shall see. Let's ask the one big question that everybody's asking this morning. If the FBI investigation is limited, and we'll know more, I think, by the end of the day, but if it doesn't come back with any new information on Brett Kavanaugh, where do we stand? Does Donald Trump get his Supreme Court nominee on the court by the end of the week?
Joe, I think that there is an overwhelming sense that if this inquiry goes forward and doesn't turn up anything particularly new, that this nomination is going to go forward. Now, I do think that there is an X factor in the degree to which this investigation is limited and has been limited. And I was talking last night as well to somebody who's familiar with these probes. And typically, when there is something like this that comes up, they do set an initial scope. The committee will say, OK, we want you to go talk to these people to look into this thing that we've heard about. But there's not typically a limit then on how far the FBI can follow those leads. So there's some very real questions right now. And I think that the sense that I'm getting is that it's actually the FBI that's particularly frustrated with what they view as political hamstringing here. So I do think ultimately, in terms of his confirmation, those are the real two questions for Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and Jeff Flake that they're going to have to answer. First, is there any new information that's potentially disqualifying? And second, do they actually believe that this was a credible probe? My gut is that, and we haven't heard a lot from these three folks, or at least from Collins and Murkowski. But Collins, in particular, has been looking for a way to vote yes. So I think if there's any way to kind of look at this in a credible way, she could potentially get there. And the other thing I wanted to raise, too, Joe, is there's a memo that went out late last night from Republicans. It's actually from Rachel Mitchell, the prosecutor. You talked about it in the 6 o'clock hour. That's the first time I've really seen Republicans lay out arguments that question Dr. Ford's credibility. And I think it's a strategy because they're letting somebody else do it. They're letting Rachel Mitchell say, OK, these are the inconsistencies in her stories. All of these things are just mixed up. That what Orrin Hatch said in a soundbite, she's kind of laying out on paper. So that shows me that there's a back half to that strategy. Yes, they were worried about the optics of the hearing, but now they got somebody else that's going to carry that water for them.
Well, and they have to be able, the FBI, it seems to me, Matt Miller, I understand the limiting of the scope as far as the witnesses that you're going to talk to, the incidents. These are the two incidents that were brought in before our committee. These are the two incidents that we want you to investigate. These are the key players we want you to investigate. I understand in a one-week investigation that makes sense. What makes no sense, though, and what Collins, Flake, and Murkowski must insist on, it seems to me, is if you get something, if you get a lead, you have to follow it. And if they're not allowed to follow leads, then it's a scam investigation, right?
That is exactly right. Look, it is not unusual for information to come in to the FBI or the committee or the White House after a background investigation has been completed. And what usually happens is the client agency, which in this case is the White House, will go back to the FBI and say, OK, we want you to go investigate this. And they will say, this is the scope. We want you to look at these allegations and whether they're true or not. What I have never heard of happening, it didn't happen in the Obama administration, is saying to the FBI, we want you to go interview only these 4 witnesses. That's where this becomes completely inappropriate. And I will tell you, I think Casey's right about the frustration within the FBI. It's not a coincidence that the limited scope of this investigation has managed to leak out over the last few days. The FBI knows exactly what's going on here, that they're being used by the White House. The White House wants to use them to give a good housekeeping stamp of approval when, in fact, the investigation is being limited from the outset, where it can only kind of produce a preordained outcome if you can't go look at everything. And I don't think the FBI is going to take very kindly to being Donald Trump's patsy, especially after the past 18 months when he has attacked them and undermined them. So I guarantee you will see more leaks from the Bureau about what the limits are on this investigation, and whether they can actually go get to the truth, which is their job, and which is what they would like to do.
Well, and the FBI is going to be getting a letter, I believe, from Senator Feinstein today, who is the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, to Director Wray. And they're going to be asking him about the scope of the investigation. Let's hope that, again, the FBI is going to be allowed to do what they need to do. John Heilman, I want to ask you the question that I asked Casey Hunt. If we move forward, no shocking revelations come out, do we see Flake, Murkowski, Collins, and Manchin end up voting for Brett Kavanaugh?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, Jeff Flake has said publicly over this weekend that he intended to vote, as he said, for Judge Kavanaugh, and that he still intends to vote for Judge Kavanaugh unless something changes in this period. So he's on the record on that front. I think Casey is right, and my interactions with Susan Collins suggest that she has been looking all along for a way to get to yes. And I believe Joe Manchin is more inclined to vote yes than to vote no. So you've got the votes right there. Lisa Murkowski is a little different because of Judge Kavanaugh's stance on Native issues and some of the politics in her state. She's probably the most likely in that group to be inclined to vote no. But again, if you have Flake and Collins and Manchin, you're there. So in the absence, again, there are lots of questions we've discussed or started to discuss this morning about the scope of this FBI inquiry and how it's conducted. But if we get to the end of the week under whatever set of circumstances and it looks as though we're still in he said, she said mode and there's been no big breakthroughs on the investigative front, I think that Donald Trump and Brett Kavanaugh will have the votes to put him on the Supreme Court.
So last night, Jeff Flake, along with Senator Coons, they were both on 60 Minutes talking about the compromise they made on Friday. And Jeff Flake said, now, I personally don't understand this, but I guess this is how people think in Washington these days. But he personally said that if he were running for re-election, there's no way he could have done what he did last night. He might as well have said that he had monkeys going out of his ears. I don't understand that line of thinking. I mean, I always found in my district, a very conservative district, that if you took a courageous stand and then you explained it to your voters, even the most conservative of voters who may not have agreed with what you did, or even the most liberal voters, they actually rewarded you for that. But Jeff Flake, Steve Kornacki, said last night that if you were running for re-election, there's no way he could have ever done what he did. That seems to feed right into the central thesis of your book, which is we are two nations, a red nation and a blue nation, and this stark division it just prevents compromises, the likes of which we saw on Friday.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned Flake, too. Flake is somebody who is sort of, when you get caught between that polarization, when you get caught in between that tribalism, this is what happens to your political career, because he took some steps in the last few years to distance himself from President Trump, and that sort of turned the Republican base in his state and nationally against him. And then he'll take other steps, though, that anger the Democrats who are eager to embrace him because the conservatives want to sort of cast him out. And it left him this year heading into his re-election in that position where he was sort of poisoned with both juries. The Republican primary electorate didn't look like it wanted to re-nominate him, and the general election audience in Arizona didn't seem like it wanted to re-elect him, and so he chose not to run again. And yes, you mentioned the book. I mean, we've been talking about polarization in politics for a long time, but that really is sort of the theme of my book. That you see the title there, The Red and the Blue, that we're living in a world that was created, a red and blue America in particular, that form of polarization, that form of tribalism, where that color syncs up with the party, where there are those deep demographic, cultural, and geographic distinctions between parties, that those distinctions, those lines were drawn in the 1990s, and we've been living in that world ever since.
So there's a stat I keep hearing, and that is that 18% of Americans control 50% of the votes in the United States Senate, and it's the most intense part of that 18%. But I mean, is part of the problem that we're seeing the fact that you have the Democratic Party that is geographically isolated on the coasts, and you've got a Republican Party that basically owns the central and western time zones.
It's
Or
interesting.
the central and mountain time zones. If Democrats can start figuring out how to win in the center of the country again, a lot of these problems might go away.
And it's interesting because we talk about the blue and red America as they're now defined. As I say, the 1990s, think of it this way. The number of counties in the country, there are over 3,100 counties in the United States. And when Bill Clinton became president back in 1992, when he won that election, Bill Clinton was able to carry in 92 and 96 almost half the counties in America. Geographically, Bill Clinton was able to carry them. That tribalism, that polarism, that red and blue, you'd said red and blue to anybody in the country in 92, 96, it would have had no political meaning. But when you fast forward to the 2000 election, when you shake out all the events of the 90s, the government shutdown, impeachment, Clinton versus Gingrich, all of that, you have that near perfect tie on election night 2000. And how many counties is Al Gore able to carry in that election? We're talking about 500 counties out of 3,100. And that's the world, even in victory. Barack Obama is only able to get up to about 800 of them in 2012. Hillary Clinton less than 500 in 2016. Blue America, as it was created in the 90s and as we have been living with since, it is a metropolitan, is a predominantly metropolitan phenomenon. There's been huge growth in Democratic strength there. Big population centers, big population dense areas. But yeah, the vastness of the country, those rural areas, those ex-urban areas, when you start talking about the U.S. Senate, that's the core of red America. That's the strength of the Republican Party over the last generation.
But at least let's talk about Bill Clinton for a second. I remember as a Republican looking at the states Bill Clinton won, and I was shocked and I was outraged that this guy from Arkansas somehow managed to win every state on the Mississippi. I was like, he won Louisiana, he won Arkansas, he won Missouri, he won Iowa, he won Minnesota. I mean, you go straight up the Mississippi River, and Bill Clinton knew how to win in the heart of America. I understand there are a lot of issues that Democrats and Republicans have with Bill Clinton right now. But a politician like that, it's not like Democrats can't find other politicians that know how to win in the center of America. And while we're all talking about how extreme Republicans are, Democrats are cloistered on the coasts and in a very limited number of counties. It seems they have got to figure out how to win in the middle again.
Well, Joe, there's just a feeling, and you can look at the numbers and the attention that Democrats give to certain races in the South, that Democrats have somewhat seeded Democratic candidates in the South who can actually make a go for it in some of these states. You look at what's happening in Tennessee. Phil Bredesen has a very good chance at picking up that Senate seat. You look at in Mississippi, where we just were, and then on our special Morning Joe from Oxford, we had the former Secretary of Agriculture, Mike Espy, on the show, who is running for the Senate seat and the special election seat, and has a pretty incredible name ID for a Democrat in the state that usually just doesn't happen, because again, at the national level, they see looking at a state like Mississippi as a possible pickup opportunity. Steve, now. Sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
You in this book, do you deal with that at all, about how we go from Bill Clinton, who was able to kind of bridge the divide and wasn't a coastal elite? I mean, after all, the man from Hope, Arkansas. How did we get to this point where it became so culturally segregated?
And it's part of the Clinton story. It's fascinating when we think back to the 90s. Part of the legacy of Bill Clinton and his success in the 90s was he was able to straddle that cultural divide. He had that sort of Bubba image. He could win back the Reagan Democrats. He could do well, where Joe was talking about. But it was always a very delicate balance, because Bill Clinton was also in alliance with a national Democratic Party that was a lot more liberal. When Bill Clinton became president in 1993, the first first thing he got sucked into as president, and think back 25 years ago, the social dynamics of this country were different, was a fight over gays in the military. And politically, for Bill Clinton, for what he had campaigned as in 1992, a different kind of Democrat who could win those states, to have that be the defining issue that began his presidency set him off as a cultural liberal, a sort of coastal, that sort of track. And you think of Bill Clinton, he won in 92 and he won in 96. In between was the lowest moment for the Democratic Party at that point, really after the Second World War. Republicans gained control of the House in 1994. They called it the Republican Revolution. Newt Gingrich became the Speaker of the House. Newt Gingrich completed basically a 16-year rise from gadfly backbencher to Speaker of the House. Republicans thought he was something close to a genius at that point. That was the backlash to Bill Clinton not being able to straddle that divide those first couple years. And then the Republicans, and Joe, I think, has some experience there in 95, 96. There was a backlash to Gingrich, and that was sort of the rise of Blue America in 96. Bill Clinton's impeachment, Bill Clinton's personal conduct with Monica Lewinsky, that turned off a lot of those culturally sensitive voters. And it was just a series of battles and flare-ups and wars. And you look at Al Gore, the legacy of the 1990s to me is that Bill Clinton and Al Gore in 1992 were nominated to win back the South. Were nominated as moderates from the South, the face of a Democratic Party that could win where it had been losing. And in 2000, Al Gore would have been president that night. Forget about Florida if he could have won Tennessee, his home state of Tennessee. And by 2000, he couldn't do that. And by 2000, Bill Clinton, who at the start of the decade was the face of the South, Arkansas base, he and Hillary said, you know what? The future, it's in New York. And he built his future. She built her future in the heart of Blue America, what had become Blue America by the end of that decade.
Yeah, John Heilemann, I saw a picture, though, of the 92 convention. Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Al Gore, Tipper Gore,
right,
all standing there smiling and waving. And somebody noted, I'm sure you saw this, somebody noted that 3 of the 4 people on the stage that night would win the popular vote for president, but only 1 of those 3 would become president.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary thing, and I'm listening to Steve Kornacki talk about this. Obviously, well, we all, those of us in our age group, Joe, went through all that in the 1990s. Another thing that, to Steve's point, is the fact that we can all remember the fact that in Bill Clinton's term, in Bill Clinton's elections, he won West Virginia, and there's literally not a state in the country right now that's more pro-Trump than the state of West Virginia. That's a state that within our adult lifetimes was a state that Democrats could win, and now is a state that is so far outside the grasp of them that Democrats don't even bother competing in them presidential elections. Again, that speaks to some of the profound changes that have happened for the Democratic Party. And in some respects, Bill Clinton's role as a modernizer of the party was incredibly successful. And in other respects, his attempt to moderate the party was a total failure. And in many respects, the party is now looks more like the party of the 1980s in terms of its ideological disposition than it does the party of Bill Clinton in the mid-1990s.
Going back to the 1984 Democrats, the San Francisco Democrats that Republicans ran against until Bill Clinton clobbered them in 1992
right,
and again in 1996. Matt Miller, if you could direct the Democrats or direct Jeff Flake to put pressure on the White House to make sure there's a fair FBI investigation this week, what would your one recommendation be?
It would be very simple. It will be that career investigators decide what to investigate and who to interview, and not political people at the White House. It's very simple. If you're looking for the truth and not looking for, a rubber stamp, then you ask people who are trained to do this to go out and do their investigation. I would be happy to have the time extended. I don't think there should be, a time limit on finding the truth. But if you want to stick with the time limit, that's fine. But let the FBI decide who they're going to interview.
All right. Well, let's hope that Jeff Flake, Lisa Murkowski, and Susan Collins heard that. Because it certainly makes a heck of a lot of sense. Matt Miller, thank you so much. And coming up next, 2 of our favorite reporters, the Washington Post's Bob Costa and Jeremy Peters from the New York Times, will be with us. Of course, everybody's our favorite reporter. Everybody's a winner, and everyone goes home with a trophy. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.